position, as I get it, is that people want less from their government no matter what. It seems sort of unlikely to me on its face, you know. Usually when we complain about governments because they're not doing something we'd like them to do, whether it's fixing the potholes or delivering the Social Security checks or whatever. But there is an opinion, one that's widely covered by the press, that people want less. If that's what people want, that's certainly what they're getting, because the American public is getting a lot less from government now than it used to. And unfortunately, is paying about as much or even more in taxes than it used to. That is, most people are. And that's happened since the early 1980s, mainly because there's been a huge shift in the tax burden. It was enacted in '78 and '81, and a huge shift in what the government spends its money on. The government spends a lot less on programs, it spends a lot more on interest than it used to. And at the same time, the tax burden has shifted so that the wealthier people are paying considerably less than they used to, as are corporations. Now, after the damage was done in the early 80s, there has been some progress to deal with it, to try to address the problem, most notably the '86 Tax Reform Act, and then more recently President Clinton's '93 Deficit Reduction Act. Those tax changes were good news for most people. By reversing some of the Reagan-era tax cuts that went to the high-income people, for instance, President Clinton's Deficit Reduction Act has helped cut the budget deficit by more than half from where it was when he took office. And it's also helped stem the tide toward ever-increasing inequality in this country. Unfortunately, the current leadership in the Congress seems bent on taking us back to the bad old days. Both their '95 budget proposals and tax proposals and their various plans for flat taxes or national sales taxes would again give us gigantic tax reductions for the wealthiest people. And unless there's going to be another ballooning in the budget deficit, once you do that, it inevitably means that average families have to pay much higher taxes or have to get even less from the government, or both. Now, what I want to do this morning is look at some of these pictures that we handed out and talk about what the information means by looking at it as sort of a question and answer. So first of all, looking at what's going on currently, there's a lot of talk about middle-class tax cuts and so forth. So what really is going on? Who's trying to give the biggest middle-class tax cut, so-called here, President Clinton or the congressional Republicans? Well, the interesting thing is that in dollars, they're very, very similar. If you look at, say, fiscal 2000, a one-year snapshot there, you say, what are these middle-class tax breaks worth? Well, they're worth about the same. The Republicans have $20 billion in so-called family tax breaks. The Democrats, or the president at least, has $19 billion. Hardly any difference at all. There are differences in the details. The president's $500 tax credit is only about half as big as the Republicans' $500 tax credit, because it only goes to kids up to 12 rather than up to 18, and because it's phased out for families so that you don't get it if you make more than $75,000, whereas the Republican plan goes up into the 200s. But the president also has a very expensive deduction for college tuition that goes to middle-income families. And he also does not have big reductions in the earned income tax credit for low and moderate income working families. You put them all together, the two plans in terms of families are about the same, although somewhat different families. The Republican plan gives more to those who make more than $100,000. The president's plan doesn't raise taxes on those who make less than $30,000. The other interesting thing, though, about these plans is when you add up the president's whole tax plan, it only costs about $7 billion a year, even though he spent $19 billion on middle-class tax breaks. The Republican plan, on the other hand, costs $40 billion a year, because not only do they have their so-called middle-class tax cut, they also have their tax cut for rich people and corporations, which is the part I think they care about the most. And the big capital gains breaks, the repeal of half of the alternative minimum tax on big companies, and a number of other corporate changes end up making the Republican plan a $40 billion a year loser. So from the middle class's point of view, you have to ask, which would you rather have? The same tax cut plus big giveaways to those at the top, or the same tax cut but preservation of government programs or a lower deficit? That's the choice, I suppose, between the two plans. Now, the next question is to look at who wins and who loses under the congressional tax plan, the one that the president vetoed The Republicans are doing ads now saying that, gee, you would have a $500 tax credit if it weren't for the president's veto, although he's proposing a $500 tax credit. But last fall, when the plan came out, we took a close look at who wins and who loses from the plan that was approved in November by the House and the Senate. And the interesting thing is, Newt was saying that the tax cuts are a reward to people for all the spending cuts they've had to endure. Well, it wasn't a reward for most people. About 2/3 of the families in this country would get nothing or would pay higher taxes under the tax plan that the Congress approved last fall. And that includes 9 million families whose taxes would go up because of the scalebacks in the earned income tax credit. And you look at the overall averages, the middle 20% of the population would get an average tax cut of $114 under the Republican plan. Most of them would get nothing, but on average it would be $114. The best off 1% would get a tax cut of $10,500 each. So middle-income people are looking at $2 a week, but those at the very top are looking at $10,500 a year, mainly from the capital gains changes. So a plan that was supposed to be something for the middle class turns out to be nothing for most people and very little even for those who get it in the middle, but a big tax break at the top. Well, I don't want to say only kind things about President Clinton. He's got something in his proposal that is, to my lights at least, very strange. He's proposed a tax deduction as a way to subsidize college expenses for people making up to about $100,000 a year. Now, sure, it would be nice if the government could afford it to help people send their kids to school. But if you were sitting down to design a program, would you design it so that the more you make, the higher share we subsidize of your college expenses? Think about this. Let's see. If you make $40,000, we ought to pay 15% of your college expenses. And if you make $100,000, we will pay 28%. No one would ever design a program like that. But that is, in fact, what the president's program entails, because it's a tax deduction, which means the benefits of it are completely dependent on what bracket you're in. So he wants to give twice as large a percentage subsidy to people making $100,000 as to people making $40,000 or $60,000 a year. It's very strange. I don't know why he's done it. It's a bad idea, and I hope that he gives it second thoughts. Of course, Bill Archer and the Republicans in the Ways and Means Committee think it's a fine idea, and they've said nice things about it, as they have about the various IRA proposals that the president has proposed, because they like upside-down subsidies, but I'm not sure why the president should. All right. Now, there's a lot of talk, there's always a lot of talk about how the government is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's out of control, and it's fat, and we got to do something about it. Well, what's actually been happening to the government over the last 15 years or so? Well, let's start with the deficit. First of all, this year the deficit is at its lowest level as a share of the economy since 1979, 2% of the GDP. That may be too much, but it's the lowest level in almost 20 years. Just 4 years ago, 1992, the deficit was 5% of the GDP, 5% of the economy. So in just these 4 years, the deficit has been cut by more than half. And it's scheduled to come down even further under the budget plans put forward by both sides here. Now, why is it down? Well, it's down in part because the economy has done better. But it's also down in part because the '93 tax legislation cut the deficit. And the '93 budget legislation cut spending. In fact, spending is now at its lowest level since before Ronald Reagan took office as a share of the economy. And if you look at the details on spending, it's even more striking. Because if you take out Social Security, which has been basically flat as a share of GDP, and you take out interest on the national debt, which of course is way up, everything else the government does, from defense to roads to justice, everything else has dropped as a share of the GDP by 23%. Almost a quarter drop in that part of the government. Well, no wonder people think they're not getting much for the government for what they pay. They're not getting nearly as much as they did before. In dollar terms, this entire rest of the government is $246 billion less than it was in 1981. And it's slated to go down even more in the future. So they cut spending tremendously, which is one reason the taxpayers are unhappy. They're getting less from the government for what they're paying. We still have